At 3:17 in the morning on November 29th, 1944, Commander Joseph Enright watched through his periscope as a warship longer than 3 football fields turned to expose her broadside, 1,400 yards ahead of his submarine. He was 34 years old, a graduate of the United States Naval Academy class of 1933, and at that moment he had 0 confirmed sinkings to his name. What he was looking at, though he did not know it yet, was the largest warship Japan had ever built, larger than any battleship, larger than any carrier in either navy, a vessel so secret that American naval intelligence had photographed her under construction and still had no idea what she was. 10 days after her commissioning, she was steaming through the waters south of Tokyo Bay, and Commander Enright's submarine, USS Archerfish, carried 24 torpedoes total. 11 months earlier, Enright's own commanding officers had nearly ended his submarine career for good. This is the story of how a man who asked to be relieved of command after what he considered a failed patrol was given one more chance, and how that chance produced the single greatest tonnage kill by a submarine in naval history. To understand what happened on the night of November the 28th into the 29th, you have to go back to October and November of 1943. When Enright commanded a brand new submarine called USS Dace. Dace had been built at the Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, and commissioned on July 23, 1943, with Enright as her first commanding officer. This was, by any measure, the assignment every submarine officer in the Pacific wanted: a new boat, an experienced crew, orders to the most target-rich waters in the entire theater, the approaches to Japan itself. Dace transited the Panama Canal and arrived at Pearl Harbor on October 3, 1943. Enright received his patrol orders on October 17th. His assigned area was Japanese home waters, the southeast coast of Honshu, the approaches to Nagoya, where intelligence reported heavy merchant traffic. Dace departed Pearl Harbor on October 20th for her first war patrol. The patrol began reasonably well. On November 7th, Enright detected a large freighter sailing unescorted through his patrol area. He maneuvered into position and fired 4 torpedoes. 3 hit, the freighter was severely damaged but did not sink, and Japanese patrol craft arrived before Enright could deliver a finishing shot, forcing Dace deep to evade depth charges. When he surfaced after dark and searched for the damaged ship, he found only debris and an oil slick. The freighter had escaped and was later confirmed by intelligence to have reached port for repairs. Damaged but not sunk. Not a kill, not a credit toward Enright's combat record. Then came November 15th. Ultra Intelligence, the code-breaking program that gave American forces advance warning of Japanese ship movements, transmitted a message to every submarine operating near Honshu. The aircraft carrier Shokaku was departing Yokosuka, course south, speed 18 knots. Shokaku was one of the 6 Japanese carriers that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7, 1941. She had fought at Coral Sea, at the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz. She was Japan's most experienced carrier, with a veteran crew and a combat record that made her the kind of target that defines a submarine captain's entire career. Enright calculated Shokaku's projected course and positioned Dace along the most likely track. He waited at periscope depth, scanning the horizon every 5 minutes through the night and into the dawn. At 8:30 in the morning, a lookout spotted a large warship on the horizon at 12,000 yards. The silhouette matched Shokaku. Enright followed standard doctrine for a carrier attack. Get ahead of the target, submerge, wait for the carrier to close the range, fire a spread. He surfaced briefly to gain speed, moved ahead of Shokaku's projected track, and submerged to wait. The carrier did not appear where he expected. Shokaku had zigzagged 30 degrees to port, and her new track would now pass 3,000 yards to the east of Dace's position, too far for an effective shot. Enright had 2 choices. He could remain submerged and fire long-range torpedoes with a low probability of hitting, or he could surface, reposition, and try again. He chose to surface and run at flank speed to regain position, but dawn was coming. Daylight visibility would let Shokaku's destroyer screen spot a surfaced submarine within minutes. By 9:40 in the morning, Enright still was not in attack position. The sun was rising. He made the decision. He ordered Dace to dive. The attack was aborted. Shokaku steamed past, completely unaware that an American submarine had been tracking her for 3 hours. Enright remained submerged until dark, surfaced, searched, and found nothing. Shokaku was gone into the Pacific. He radioed his patrol report. Contact made. Attack aborted due to unfavorable geometry and approaching daylight. No damage inflicted. The patrol continued for 3 more weeks. On November 23rd, Enright found a tanker, maneuvered into position, and was driven off by escort ships before he could fire. The tanker escaped undamaged. Dace returned to Midway on December 11th. 49 days at sea. 0 confirmed sinkings. 1 freighter damaged but not sunk. 1 missed opportunity against the single most valuable carrier target available in the entire Pacific theater. Enright knew exactly what this meant. The patrol report would be reviewed by Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarine Force Pacific, a man known for giving his captains real tactical freedom, but also known for relieving commanders who did not produce results. Enright did not wait for that judgment to come to him. On December 12th, he submitted a formal request to his command. He wrote that he had been responsible for an unproductive patrol and requested to be relieved by an officer who could perform more satisfactorily. The request reached Lockwood's desk on December 14th. Lockwood granted it immediately. Enright was relieved of command of Dace and assigned to administrative duties at the submarine base at Midway. The new commanding officer took Dace out and went on to sink multiple Japanese ships, eventually earning the boat a Presidential Unit citation. Dace had been successful. To everyone at Midway, the conclusion seemed obvious. Enright had been the problem. He spent the next 6 months processing patrol reports, coordinating logistics, and assigning repair schedules. Desk work, the kind of duty that ended submarine careers permanently. The submarine force had more qualified commanding officers than it had submarines to give them, and officers who failed in command rarely got a second look. They went to surface ships or shore stations, and their submarine days were over. Enright refused to accept this. In June of 1944, he requested a meeting with Admiral Lockwood. The meeting lasted 15 minutes. Enright told Lockwood directly that his failure on Dace had come from excessive caution, from following doctrine too rigidly instead of trusting his own judgment in the moment, and that he had learned from it. He asked for another command. Lockwood reviewed his record. Naval Academy class of 1933, upper third of his class. 3 years on the battleship Maryland. Submarine qualification in 1936. 8 years of submarine experience before the war even started. Command of a smaller submarine, and then Dace. 0 sinkings. But apart from the Shokaku decision, 0 major errors either. Lockwood made his decision, but did not act on it immediately. Enright remained at Midway through the summer. Finally, in late August, Lockwood summoned him. USS Archerfish needed a new commanding officer. Her 4th war patrol had just ended with no sinkings. The crew was experienced but frustrated. Lockwood told him directly that they needed a commander who would be aggressive, and asked if Enright could be that commander. Enright said yes. On September 1st, 1944, Commander Joseph Enright took command of USS Archerfish, a Balau-class submarine that had completed 4 war patrols with minimal success. This was his second chance, the kind the submarine force almost never granted. Now, moved to the night of November 28th into the 29th. At 8:48 in the evening, Archerfish was running on the surface roughly 60 miles south of Tokyo Bay. Enright had been assigned lifeguard duty, positioned to rescue any B-29 bomber crews that went down during raids on Tokyo. The raids had been canceled that morning. Enright was free to hunt. His radar operator called out a contact. 2 ships, 12 miles away, bearing north, large radar returns. Enright ordered flank speed and moved to intercept. By 10 o'clock, lookouts had the contacts visually. 1 massive vessel with 3 destroyer escorts running close formation around it. The large ship's silhouette looked, at first glance, like it could be a tanker. But Enright studied it through binoculars, and the profile was wrong. Too much superstructure, too much height. This was a warship, possibly a battleship, possibly a carrier. His executive officer estimated the target's length at over 800 feet. Whatever it was the largest Japanese warship Enright had ever encountered. What followed was a pursuit that lasted approximately 6.5 hours, and the specific details of that pursuit are worth walking through because they explain exactly how, A single diesel submarine managed to get into position against a fast-moving task force with a destroyer screen specifically tasked with preventing exactly this outcome. The destroyers were running anti-submarine zigzag patterns, forcing irregular course changes on the whole formation. Enright tracked them from 12,000 yards, watching, calculating speed and heading. The Japanese ships were making 20 knots. Archerfish could make 20 knots on the surface, but only barely, and only by pushing her engines beyond their rated sustained output. The chase began in earnest around 9:30. Enright ordered all 4 diesel engines to maximum output. Archerfish's engines were rated for sustained operation at 1,600 horsepower each. Flank speed meant pushing them to 1,800. The chief engineer warned that sustained operation at this level risked damaging the shafts. Enright accepted the risk. Missing this target was not an option he was willing to consider. The engine room crew monitored temperatures, pressures, and fuel consumption continuously. The diesels roared. Black smoke poured from the exhaust ports, invisible in the darkness to Japanese lookouts but audible across the water if the range closed too much. Enright kept Archerfish at least 8,000 yards behind the formation, close enough to track, far enough to avoid detection. The Japanese zigzag pattern turned out to be remarkably consistent. Every 12 minutes, the formation turned 30 degrees left or right. Enright timed these intervals precisely. If the pattern held, the Japanese ships would zigzag within striking range of Archerfish's position, sometime around 2:30 in the morning. That would put Enright ahead of them, in position to submerge and execute a classic ambush. But the pattern did not hold perfectly. At 11 o'clock, the formation turned back toward the northwest, which actually brought them closer, the range dropping to 7,000 yards, close enough that Enright's sonar operator could detect propeller sounds through the water. Enright ordered the crew to absolute quiet. No unnecessary movement, no loud talk. Sound traveled through water far more efficiently than through air, and a careless noise could alert Japanese sonar operators to a contact they did not yet know was there. By 11:30, the zigzag angle had changed from 30 degrees to 25, meaning the formation was covering more distance on each leg. Enright adjusted his course to compensate. At midnight, he was 6,000 yards behind, still closing, but slowly, and his chief engineer reported the engine temperatures were approaching their safe limits. Enright ordered a brief reduction to 1,700 horsepower to let things cool. Archerfish's speed dropped to 19.5 knots. The Japanese held at 20. The gap began to widen again. 8,000 yards. At 12:30, Enright ordered power back up to 1,800 horsepower. The gap stabilized and began closing again. 7,500. As 7,000. Then at 1 in the morning, the Japanese formation turned southwest, directly away from Archerfish. This was the worst possible geometry. Enright was now chasing them directly from astern, a position from which a faster ship maintaining course indefinitely could never be caught. He considered his options: break off and search elsewhere, radio for support from other submarines in the area, or continue and hope for another zigzag that would improve the angle. He decided to continue. He believed this was a carrier, and if it was, it justified every risk involved in the chase. At 1:30, the Japanese held their southwest course, and Enright paralleled them at 8,000 yards. His fuel was becoming a real concern. Running at flank speed burned fuel at 3 times the normal rate, and Archerfish had enough remaining for roughly 6 more hours of this. After that, he would need to reduce power to preserve enough reserve to get back to friendly waters. He checked his watch. By 7:30 in the morning, he would have to break off the chase regardless of what happened, or risk not making it home. At 2 o'clock, the Japanese formation zigzagged again, turning northwest back toward their original track. The geometry improved instantly. Enright was now 7,000 yards behind, but slightly ahead of their baseline course. By 2:30, recalculating again, he found himself 6,000 yards behind, but genuinely ahead of where the formation's track was heading. If they zigzagged southwest one more time, they would pass within 5,000 yards of his position. Enright briefed his officers. When the Japanese turn southwest, we submerge. We position across their track. We wait for them to close the range. We fire all 6 bow tubes in one spread, every torpedo we have forward. This target is too big to waste shots on a second attempt. We fire everything, dive deep, and evade. At 2:56, the Japanese formation turned southwest. The geometry was exactly what Enright needed. He ordered dive. Archerfish slipped beneath the surface smoothly and quietly. Ballast tanks flooded. The boat descended to periscope depth, 60 feet. Enright raised the scope and scanned. The Japanese formation was 7,000 yards out, closing at 20 knots. Time to contact, approximately 17 minutes. He lowered the scope immediately. No reason to leave a periscope wake visible to alert lookouts. The crew rigged for silent running, ventilation fans off. Every piece of machinery that made unnecessary noise was isolated. The only sounds left in the boat were the quiet hum of the electric motors and the breathing of 81 men. At 3 o'clock, Enright raised the scope for another look. 5,000 yards now, and the ship was unmistakable. A flight deck, an island superstructure, a carrier, definitely a carrier, and one larger than anything in any recognition manual he had ever studied. He could see what appeared to be aircraft on the deck. These were actually Oka rocket bombs, kamikaze weapons, though Enright had no way to identify them at that distance. He made quick sketches of the silhouette, the length, the beam, the superstructure layout. These details would matter enormously to naval intelligence later. At 3:04, the carrier appeared to be passing north of Archerfish's position. Wrong angle. Enright needed the ship to expose her broadside, because a bow or stern shot against a target this size required near-perfect geometry to be effective at all. Then at 3:12, the carrier turned south, another 30-degree zigzag, and this turn put her on a near-collision course with Archerfish's position. The geometry was now exactly right. Enright ordered the final approach. Archerfish crept forward at 2 knots. The range closed. 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,200. The destroyer screen was spread 300 yards ahead of the carrier, and if Archerfish got any closer, those destroyers would detect her. Enright had to fire now. At 1,400 yards, he set his firing solution. All 6 forward tubes ready. He set the torpedoes to run at 10 feet depth, shallow. Standard doctrine called for 15 to 20 feet to detonate below the waterline, but Enright reasoned that a carrier this size would have anti-torpedo bulges below the waterline, armored compartments specifically designed to absorb explosions at that depth. He wanted his torpedoes to strike higher, above those bulges, where the hull plating would be thinner. If they ran a little deeper than set, they would still hit below the waterline regardless. Either way, the carrier would flood. He called out the firing sequence. Tube 1, fire, 8-second interval. Tube 2, fire. Tube 3, fire. Tubes 4, 5, 6, fire. 6 torpedoes running hot, straight, and true. Enright kept his eye pressed to the periscope and watched the first torpedo's track close the distance. 45 seconds to impact. It ran straight, no deviation. At 3:17, it struck the carrier's starboard side amidships. A massive fireball erupted at the point of impact. The shock of the explosion traveled through the water and into Archerfish's hull as a deep booming crack. 8 seconds later, the second torpedo hit. Another fireball, another explosion. The crew cheered. Enright kept watching. The third torpedo struck near the stern. The fourth hit forward of amidships. 4 confirmed hits. The 5th and 6th either ran underneath the hull or missed wide, and Enright never saw them detonate. There was no time to confirm. The destroyer screen had already pinpointed the torpedo wakes and was turning toward Archerfish's position. Depth charges were coming. Enright ordered a dive to 400 feet. Archerfish dropped fast, venting and flooding tanks. 400 feet was close to crush depth for a Balau-class boat, whose test depth was rated at 312 feet with an operational maximum of 400. Beyond that, the pressure hull would fail. Enright was gambling that the Japanese depth charges were set to detonate at a shallower depth than where he was actually going. Archerfish reached 400 feet at 3:23. The crew rigged for silent running again. No talking, no movement beyond essential systems. They waited in the dark, listening. The first depth charge detonated at 3:26, at least 500 yards away. The destroyers were attacking where Archerfish should have been, according to the torpedo track geometry, not where she actually was. 13 more depth charges followed over the next 12 minutes. None came close. By 3:47, the attack stopped. The destroyers had lost contact entirely. Enright held Archerfish at 400 feet for another hour, listening through the hydrophones to the sounds of the surface battle above. The carrier's engines had stopped. He could hear breaking up noises, loud metallic groaning and cracking, the sound of bulkheads collapsing and compartments flooding. The carrier was dying. The breaking up sounds continued for 47 minutes, timed precisely by the sonar operator, and then silence. Enright assumed the carrier had sunk. He recorded the time as 4:34. He was wrong, the carrier was still afloat. But a submarine at 400 feet cannot see the surface, and the sounds Enright heard told him, reasonably, that the target was finished. At 5 o'clock, he brought Archerfish cautiously to periscope depth, raised the scope for 3 seconds, did a quick sweep. No contacts, no destroyers, no carrier, no wreckage. Empty ocean. He lowered the scope, descended to 200 feet, and set course south, away from Tokyo Bay. Archerfish had survived. Enright estimated his target as a Hayataka-class carrier of roughly 28,000 tons. He was wrong about that too. The ship he had hit displaced 72,000 tons, and at 5 in the morning, when Enright last looked through his periscope, she was still afloat, still steaming south at 18 knots, with 4 torpedo holes flooding her hull from the inside. The Japanese had named her Shinano. The name belonged to the longest river in Japan, a designation reserved for capital ships of genuine strategic importance. To understand what Shinano actually was, you need to go back to 1940 and the original Yamato-class building program. Shinano had been laid down as a battleship, the third hull in the Yamato class, the most powerful battleships ever constructed. 18-inch main guns, 72,000-ton displacement, armor thick enough to withstand any naval gun afloat. Construction began in May of 1940 at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. Japan had originally planned 5 Yamato-class battleships. Only 2, Yamato and Musashi, were ever completed as battleships. The third hull, designated Hull Number 110, sat partially complete at Yokosuka when the Battle of Midway ended on June 7, 1942. Midway had cost Japan 4 fleet carriers in a single day. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, all sunk. The Imperial Japanese Navy faced a carrier shortage it had no quick way to fix. Building a new fleet carrier from the keel up took 3 years minimum, and the Americans were building carriers faster than Japan could sink them. Naval architects proposed converting Hull 110 from a battleship into an aircraft carrier. The conversion would take roughly 2 years, faster than starting fresh. The proposal was approved that same month. The hull already had its armor belt installed and its lower decks framed. The conversion meant removing the planned battleship superstructure and replacing it with a flight deck and hangar bays, while keeping the existing armor belt and hull structure intact. The theory was a carrier built on the bones of a battleship, combining a carrier's striking power with a battleship's survivability. Construction continued through 1943 and into 1944 under absolute secrecy. American reconnaissance flights photographed the Yokosuka yard repeatedly, but the construction slip stayed covered with camouflage netting throughout. American intelligence knew Japan was building something enormous there, but had no idea what it was or how big. On November 1, 1944, a B-29 on a reconnaissance flight photographed Shinano during sea trials. The photographs clearly showed a carrier, but analysts could not match the silhouette to any known Japanese carrier class. It went onto the list of unidentified targets with no estimate of size or capability attached. Shinano was commissioned on November 19, 1944, under Captain Toshio Abe. The ceremony was brief because the ship was nowhere near combat ready. Watertight doors were not installed throughout the hull. Pumps were missing from critical compartments. The crew was almost entirely inexperienced, most of them having never served on a carrier before. Abe requested 2 more months to finish fitting out and train his people properly. He was denied. American B-29 raids on Tokyo were increasing in frequency, and Shinano sitting at Yokosuka was a target. The decision was made to move her to Kure Naval Base in the Inland Sea, where she could complete fitting out under better protection. The voyage was roughly 300 miles, about 17 hours at cruising speed. Abe wanted to wait for better weather and a larger escort. He was ordered to depart immediately with whatever escort was available. 3 destroyers were assigned, Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamikaze. Good ships with experienced crews, but 3 destroyers for a carrier this size was barely adequate. Standard practice called for at least 6. Abe protested. He was overruled. Shinano departed Yokosuka at 1:30 in the afternoon on November 28, 1944. 9 days after her commissioning, her cargo holds carried 50 Oka rocket bombs destined for kamikaze bases in Kyushu. 6 Shinyo suicide boats were lashed to her flight deck. Her hangar bays were empty of operational aircraft. She was, in this moment, a ferry, not a fighting ship. The task group cleared the approaches to Tokyo Bay by 6:30 that evening and set course southwest for Kure, running at 20 knots in a standard anti-submarine zigzag, 30-degree turns every 12 minutes. Abe's intelligence briefing had warned of 3 confirmed American submarine contacts in the area over the preceding week. One of those contacts was Archerfish, though Abe had no way to know her designation. At 8:48 that evening, Shinano's radar detected a surface contact 12 miles to the south. Abe assumed it was an American submarine and ordered a course change to avoid it. The contact paralleled the new course. Abe increased speed to 22 knots. The contact maintained distance without closing. Abe considered the situation and concluded he might be facing an American wolf pack, multiple submarines coordinating an attack and relaying position reports. Standard doctrine in that situation was to outrun them and clear the area before they could establish attack positions. Abe believed he had a 2-knot speed advantage and could simply leave any surfaced American submarine behind. He ordered flank speed. The order was immediately countermanded by his engineering officer. The starboard outboard propeller shaft bearing was overheating. Running at flank speed risked permanently damaging the shaft. Engineering recommended reducing to 18 knots until the bearing cooled. Abe had no real choice. At 11:22 that night, Shinano reduced speed to 18 knots, the same speed Archerfish could make on the surface. Enright was no longer falling behind. He was keeping pace exactly. Abe's executive officer suggested launching aircraft to search for the submarine contact. Shinano had no operational aircraft aboard, only cargo in the hangars. His operations officer suggested using searchlights to force any surfaced submarines to dive. Abe refused, reasoning that searchlights would reveal Shinano's position to every submarine within 20 miles. The operations officer suggested requesting land-based air cover. Abe refused that too, fearing radio transmissions would reveal his position to American codebreakers. Abe was trying to slip past whatever was out there through stealth and speed. He did not realize his stealth had already failed, and his speed advantage had just evaporated due to a mechanical problem he could not fix. At 2:56 in the morning, Shinano turned southwest. This placed Archerfish, submerged and waiting, 5,000 yards directly ahead of Shinano's new course. Abe's lookout saw nothing. At 3:15, 4 torpedoes struck Shinano's starboard side. The first hit near the stern, flooding refrigerated storage compartments and 1 empty aviation gasoline tank. Engineering personnel sleeping in the spaces above were killed instantly by the impact and the flooding. The bulkheads separating these compartments from adjacent spaces held at first, but they had not been designed to withstand sustained pressure from continuous flooding. The second torpedo struck the starboard outboard propeller shaft, the same shaft that had been overheating. The shaft tunnel flooded immediately, and the outboard engine room flooded within 3 minutes. The third torpedo hit boiler room number 3 directly. Every man on watch in that compartment was killed. The room flooded completely within 2 minutes, and structural failure caused the 2 adjacent boiler rooms to flood as well. 3 boiler rooms lost in a matter of minutes, taking half of Shinano's power generation capacity with them. The fourth torpedo struck the starboard air compressor room. The explosion destroyed the compressed air systems that powered the damage control equipment throughout the ship, and the anti-aircraft magazines adjacent to the compressor room flooded as well. The damage control teams responded immediately, closing watertight doors and activating pumps, trying to contain the flooding. But the watertight doors were not finished. Gaps remained between the door frames and the surrounding bulkheads, and water poured through those gaps continuously. The additional pumps that had been planned for the ship had never arrived before she left Yokosuka. Damage control crews resorted to portable pumps and bucket brigades. It was not nearly enough. By 3:30, Abe assessed the situation. 4 compartments flooded, 3 boiler rooms lost, multiple uncontrolled leaks through the incomplete watertight doors. Shinano was taking on water faster than the pumps could remove it, and she was listing 7 degrees to starboard. Abe had 3 real options. Order counter flooding to correct the list, reduce speed and commit everything to damage control, or attempt to beach the ship on the nearest coastline, roughly 60 miles away. He chose none of these. He ordered Shinano to maintain maximum speed toward the nearest Japanese naval base, believing that speed would reduce the window for additional submarine attacks, and that the ship could survive long enough to reach port. This was the wrong decision. Maintaining speed increased the water pressure against the already damaged hull, and the incomplete watertight doors could not hold against it. Water flooded through the gaps into compartments that had been dry minutes earlier. The list increased to 10 degrees by 4 o'clock, 14 degrees by 5. At 5:30, the engineering officer reported to Abe directly. The flooding could not be contained. The pumps were losing the fight. Shinano would sink unless immediate action was taken. Abe finally ordered counter-flooding. It was too late. The list had already exceeded the angle at which counter-flooding could be effective. The engineering officer recommended reducing speed to give the damage control teams time to shore up bulkheads and seal leaks manually. Abe agreed. At 6 o'clock, Shinano slowed to 12 knots. The list stabilized at 14 degrees, and the damage control teams worked through the flooded sections, sealing what they could and activating every pump still functioning. But the underlying design was fatally flawed. Post-war analysis by American naval engineers determined that the joint between the waterline armor belt and the underwater anti-torpedo bulge had been poorly designed from the start. Enright's torpedoes had struck precisely along this weak joint. The force of the explosions had dislodged a structural I-beam inside one of the flooded boiler rooms, and that beam punched through into an adjacent boiler room, creating an additional leak that could not be sealed by any means available aboard the ship. At 7 o'clock, the executive officer reported to Abe that the carrier was doomed, the list increasing despite everything the crews were doing. Abe refused to accept it. He ordered all non-essential personnel to assemble on the port side of the flight deck, hoping the shifted weight of 1,200 men might counterbalance the list. It did not. By 8 o'clock, the list had reached 18 degrees. Water was flooding into spaces that had been completely dry 2 hours earlier. Shinano's speed had dropped to 6 knots. The escorting destroyers stayed in formation, ready to take on survivors, but Abe still believed the ship could be saved. At 9, the list reached 25 degrees. Men on the lower decks could no longer stand upright. Equipment broke loose and slid into the starboard bulkheads with each lurch. Abe finally acknowledged reality and ordered all non-essential personnel to abandon ship. 1,200 sailors and civilian workers moved to the flight deck. The destroyers closed alongside to take survivors aboard. But the severe list made the transfer extremely difficult. Rope ladders were rigged from the flight deck down to the destroyer decks, and men climbed down slowly and carefully. The transfer took 90 minutes. By 10:30, the list reached 40 degrees. The carrier was rolling onto her side. Abe ordered everyone remaining, roughly 800 men, to abandon ship. They jumped from the flight deck into the water, and the destroyers moved in to pick them up. At 10:57, Shinano capsized and sank. Final position, 33 degrees, 45 minutes north, 137 degrees, 4 minutes east, approximately 65 miles southeast of Cape Shiono. 1,435 men died. 1,080 were rescued. Captain Abe went down with his ship. Shinano had been in commission for 10 days. She had steamed roughly 170 miles from Yokosuka. She never launched a single aircraft. She never fired her guns at an enemy ship. 4 torpedoes from 1 American submarine had ended the largest warship ever built. Enright knew none of this as it was happening. Archerfish continued south at standard speed, clearing the area. At 8 in the morning, he surfaced and transmitted his contact report to Pacific Fleet headquarters. Enemy carrier attacked at 3:17. 4 torpedo hits observed. Target believed sunk. He estimated the carrier at 28,000 tons, the largest figure his recognition training gave him any reference point for. Naval intelligence reviewed his report and his sketches and compared them against every known Japanese carrier class. Nothing matched. The analyst concluded he had probably sunk a merchant hull, converted into an auxiliary carrier, possibly a tanker conversion, and 28,000 tons seemed a reasonable estimate for something like that. Enright was credited with sinking a carrier of unidentified class, pending post-war confirmation. Archerfish continued her patrol for another 2 weeks without finding anything significant. On December 8th, she fired 4 torpedoes at 2 Japanese escort vessels without scoring hits. On December 15th, she returned to Guam, ending her 5th war patrol after 48 days at sea. 1 carrier sunk, of unconfirmed identity. Enright's executive officer, his lookouts, and his sonar operator all corroborated the attack. 47 minutes of breaking up noises confirmed the target had suffered catastrophic damage. But without photographs or any prisoner confirmation, naval intelligence could not officially verify what had actually been sunk. Enright received the Navy Cross. Archerfish received a Presidential Unit citation describing a 6.5-hour pursuit that penetrated a destroyer screen and sank, in the citation's words, a large Japanese aircraft carrier with all 6 torpedoes finding their mark. The citation was accurate in every detail except one. Only 4 of the 6 torpedoes had actually hit. The Navy never corrected it. Enright returned to sea in January 1945 for Archerfish's 6th Patrol, operating as part of a wolf pack in the South China Sea with Enright commanding the group. On February 14th, he attacked what he believed was a Japanese submarine that submerged before visual confirmation could be made. He fired and claimed a kill that post-war records were never able to confirm. The 6th Patrol ended early, on March 3rd, 3 days ahead of schedule, after Archerfish developed mechanical problems with her forward diving planes and returned to Pearl Harbor for repairs. Enright was promoted to commander and reassigned to staff duties. His career as a submarine captain was over. Archerfish continued under new commanding officers and survived the war. Decommissioned in June 1946, recommissioned for Cold War service in March 1952, decommissioned again in October 1955, recommissioned a second time in August 1957 as an auxiliary submarine, and finally decommissioned for good in May 1968. On October 19, 1968, she was sunk as a target by USS Snook off the coast of California. The submarine that had sunk the largest warship in history ended her own days as target practice. Enright's career continued through the 1950s. He commanded Submarine Division 31, then USS Fulton, then Submarine Squadron 8. He served as Chief of Staff for the Atlantic Fleet Submarine Force and commanded USS Boston before retiring in 1963 with the rank of captain. After retirement, he worked for Northrop Corporation on the Omega navigation system and lived quietly in Fairfax, Virginia, rarely speaking publicly about Shinano in the years right after the war, because the Navy's official record still listed his kill as a 28,000-ton carrier of unidentified type. That changed in 1949, when American occupation forces in Japan gained access to Imperial Japanese Navy records documenting every warship the Empire had commissioned during the war. One entry stood out: Shinano, aircraft carrier, hull 110, commissioned November 19, 1944, sunk November 29, 1944. Position 33 degrees 45 minutes north, 137 degrees 4 minutes east. Caused torpedo attack by American submarine. Displacement 72,000 long tons. The position matched. The date matched. The cause matched. Enright had not sunk a 28,000-ton escort carrier. He had sunk a 72,000-ton supercarrier, the largest warship afloat anywhere in the world at the time of her loss. Naval intelligence revised his record accordingly. The designation changed from an unidentified Hayataka-class vessel to Shinano. The tonnage changed from 28,000 to 72,000. Enright's achievement became, officially, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine in naval history. That record still stands today, more than 80 years later. His Navy Cross citation was never formally amended, but the achievement itself became widely recognized among naval historians and submarine veterans. In 1987, Enright published a memoir titled Shinano, The Sinking of Japan's Secret Supership, written with the assistance of naval historian Robert Underbrink, documenting the patrol in detail using the original patrol report, interviews with surviving crew, and analysis of the captured Japanese records. The book became required reading at the Naval Submarine School in Groton, where officers studied his patience during the 6-hour surface pursuit, his decision to set the torpedoes shallow against doctrine, and his dive to 400 feet to escape the depth charge attack. Enright died on July 20, 2000, at his home in Fairfax, Virginia. He was 89 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, and submarine veterans from across the country attended. His widow donated his Navy Cross and the Presidential Unit Citation to the Naval Submarine Force Museum in Groton, where they remain on display alongside Archerfish's battle flag and Enright's original periscope sketches of Shinano. Shinano herself remains where she sank, 65 miles southeast of Cape Shiono, in roughly 4,000 meters of water. Japanese maritime law prohibits diving on the site as a war grave. Sonar surveys conducted by Japanese research vessels in 1978 confirmed the wreck lies inverted, her flight deck resting against the seabed, with 1,435 men still entombed inside. The 3 destroyers that rescued Shinano's survivors had their own endings. Isokaze and Hamikaze were both sunk by American carrier aircraft on April 7, 1945, during the Battle of Okinawa, the same day, in the same engagement. Yukikaze survived the war and was transferred to the Republic of China Navy as part of post-war reparations, serving until 1966 before being scrapped in 1969. She was the last living witness to what had happened that night south of Tokyo Bay. Archerfish's surviving crew held reunions every 5 years for decades. Enright attended every one until his death in 2000. By 2010, most of the crew had passed away. The last surviving crew member from the 5th War Patrol died in 2015. What remains is the documentation, the patrol report filed in December 1944, the memoir, the sketches. A crew of 81 men tracked a Japanese task force for 6 hours through total darkness, maneuvered into position, fired 6 torpedoes, and sank the largest warship ever built, in an action that took less than a minute from first impact to the final torpedo. The consequences of that minute lasted for the rest of the war, and, in the case of the 1,435 men still aboard her, for the rest of time. Shinano was Japan's last realistic hope for restoring any kind of carrier presence in the Pacific. Her loss removed any possibility of challenging the American fast carrier task forces. The kamikaze campaign would continue without her, but the question of the war's outcome was no longer in doubt by the time she went down. The only remaining question was how much longer the fighting would last, and every week it continued meant more cities burned and more men died on every side. A man who had once asked to be relieved of his own command, certain he had failed, spent 6 months behind a desk, processing other men's patrol reports before anyone gave him another ship. 11 months after that request, he sank the largest warship in the history of naval warfare. Did anyone in your family serve aboard a United States submarine in the Pacific, or aboard one of the Japanese ships that went down in those waters? Drop their name and vessel in the comments. Let's make sure they are remembered.